Don't we normally start, we normally, yeah, this is not the intro. We do the intro at the end. This is not, because we're gonna be like, we're gonna unbox the blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And then we start doing the unboxing, okay? So let's get into it. Unboxing a resin printer, pretty uneventful. Standard packaging, remove all that, peel that plastic off, and this is what you're left with. So let's quickly review the items that came inside the box here. We have your standard after-service sales card or warranty card, instruction manual, please read your manual. And we have some mail, or it looks like a large novelty envelope, and in here there is spare film. Now, I would normally say FEP film, but off the top of my head, I'm not actually sure if they're using FEP anymore. So there's one spare film in here, and there's a card. I'm gonna guess this is for leveling. Yep, so this card here has leveling instructions on it. It doesn't specifically say that this is the leveling card itself, and it is kind of thick, like a cue card. Normally, I'd be doing my leveling with my build plate with like 50 micron or like standard printer paper thickness, so 0.05 millimeters or so. This is definitely at least twice as thick as that, but it's the only card in here, so I'm gonna guess that this is a leveling card. Now, the instructions are there for, for handy reference. They're also probably in the manual, and like most resin printers, this is gonna come leveled out of the factory. It's always nice to double check, so we'll talk about that briefly in a little bit. And then inside this bag, we have the metal scraper. Just be careful when using a metal scraper on your build plate. You don't want to gouge the build plate. It is good for getting under a corner of your item and peeling that up, kind of breaking that seal. And then you have your plastic scraper, which is what I would use more often. You have your standard strainers for straining your resin as you put it back into your bottle. You want to make sure that there's no little islands or pieces of broken off supports or something that are in your resin, and now you're contaminating your other bottle of resin. If you do have a little piece like that gets poured into your vat, it's going to squeeze against the film and the screen when you zero your build plate, and if that resin is hardened, it could damage something. We've got a couple Allen keys, and then we have a USB stick. So this will have probably the instruction manual as well in digital, as well as on their website, and I'm hoping a couple example models that are pre-sliced and ready to go. All right, with that said, I think I'm gonna go off camera for a bit and we're gonna check out the software. All right, so just to make sure I'm getting the newest version of the software, I'm gonna go to Creality.com and go to support and then the download center. And along the left-hand side on the download center here, we'll see resin 3D printers. And then I've got the Halot One Pro. So you can get the firmware from here, and I know that there is a newer version of the firmware than what's on this machine, but I'm gonna do it over the Wi-Fi. So we'll see that on the screen on the printer itself. But for the software, I'm gonna download HalotBox here. Okay, double-clicking the installer, you're brought up with the language selection, standard kind of, I agree, next, 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 next. And it's called HalotBox. I believe it's a fork or a clone of Chitdu-Box. If I had to guess. A lot of these printers are Chitdu-based printers from like a board and hardware perspective. Okay, and now that it's done, I'm just gonna hit run. Okay, so let's choose our printer. Like I said, Halot One Pro. Please select the printer model. Yes, Halot One Pro. And then it's automatically got the build size, so 130 by 122.4 and 0.56, that's kind of interesting. Referring back to the manual, I think the official spec is 130 by 122 on the dot, so that's interesting. 160 high, so that matches. And yeah, 2560 by 2400, which gives us an XY resolution of 0.051 millimeters. And that's what it looks like. Hit OK. So I could go to free model and kind of browse online repository of models. But in this case, I'm going to open up the Amerilabs town test resin print, kind of like Resin Benchy. Okay, so I just went open, chose the file that I downloaded here, the Amerilabs Town, and if we zoom in a little bit here, you can see it's kind of like a skyscraper. There we go. So it's like a skyscraper with all these little tines up at the top here, some sharp overhangs, and I think on the side of this building it's got the Amerilabs logo, and this should be able to print just like this. On the back, there's a bunch of kind of inset sections, so these should all be discrete, fully squared off voids. They have even the size of these little tines here, and these tines get smaller as they go across the top. I think they go across the top. So this is the size of these little protruding pieces. So you can see, not really, it'd be difficult to measure that, I think, accurately, but it's more, is everything sharp and clean and discrete there? Are these squared off, these overhangs good? You can check a whole bunch of things. Their website actually goes over conclusions you can draw from how things have turned out on this. So feel free to check out Amerilabs for that. But I'm going to do this as a test print in addition to the files that are on the SD card. So how am I going to slice this? Well, I can move it around the build plate if I wanted to. And then support, I could lift it off the bed and put it on a bed of nails with a raft and everything. But in this case, this is designed to be printed flat on the build plate, and I don't really care if this bottom gets overexposed. Those bottom layers, we increase the exposure time for those, so that can kind of flare them out as they get overexposed. But we're really most concerned about build plate adhesion there, so probably 40 seconds or something on a mono printer like this. In case I didn't already mention that, it is a mono printer. So it's a monochrome screen. So the screen itself, the LCD, is going to absorb much less of the UV light. And so instead of it being 6, 8, 10 seconds, something like that, depending on our resins, to cure each layer, at 50 micron or 0.05 millimeter layers, we're going to be in the 3 seconds, maybe 2, might be pushing it, 2.5 seconds. Again, it's going to depend on the resin you're using. So the resin that I'm going to use is 3D Resin Solutions Fast Plus. And on their website, they don't actually have an exposure for this exact printer, but they say it's somewhere between 2 and 3.5. So I'm going to do this at 3, just to be safe for our standard layers. Bottom layers, 40 seconds, that should be fine. The default motor speed is 1 millimeter per second or 60 millimeters per minute. You could increase this. I'll leave it at the default. The rising height, this is how high the build plate is going to rise after each layer before coming back down to print the next layer. So it's going to rise up 6 millimeters. That makes sure that we're detached from the film, but also allows the resin to kind of flow back underneath the print so that there's resin there for the next layer. You can start getting pretty aggressive with some of these things. Especially depending on what you're printing. You might only need this to lift 4 millimeters, and that can save a lot of time considering there are 600 layers or something to this. That extra 2 millimeters at 1 millimeter a second is going to take 2 extra seconds on the up and the down side. So you're looking at 4 seconds there per layer. So it's a lot. Anyway, I'll leave these at kind of all stock. Now, turn off delay. This is the way they describe it is a little bit confusing. So this is the time after the build plate comes back down that it waits before it turns on the light. Now, I don't know why you would wait 4 seconds. There could be a mechanical reason where it takes the light 1 second to respond to a request for light. So maybe you have to have it as 1 second or 2 seconds or something. 4 seems really long to me. I'm just going to turn that right down. And then we're going to do 2 of those bottom layers. So we're going to have 2 layers exposed at that 40-second range. There are advanced options here, and sorry, just to mention here, consumables. I can add a consumable in here, so I can take these settings that I've got and I can call it 3DRS or 3D Resin Solutions Fast Plus. And this Fast Plus, I can't put a plus, it won't let me do special characters, so I'll just call it Fast Plus, and this is in black. So if you have a very low pigmented resin, your exposure settings may be quite different. 3 seconds might cause overexposure on a less opaque pigmented resin or even a transparent resin. So I like to keep the color in here. And then any dark or heavily pigmented, I'll probably use very, very similar, if not identical settings to this. So I'm going to save this so that I have that as a preset. And then that way, if I go and start tuning it, I can just save them over top. All right, so we're going to hit slice here. And we can see it building layer by layer. It says their total floors are 300. Tells you the size. It tells you, here's a kind of a summary here of our settings. How much resin we're going to use. So we're going to use 1.46 milliliters or so. It's going to weigh approximately this. That's, you got to put in the resin density and such to get that accurate. Tells you the overall volume of that build, time, etc. And so I can do a few things here. I can hit local print, which is going to ask me to save it, or I can do remote printing. And this is where it's going to print over Wi-Fi. It'll basically load it to the machine. And I can hit upload, and it says you can't do this without logging to create a Creality Cloud. So this is uploading it to your Creality Cloud and then going to the machine and printing from Creality Cloud. Now, I'm not going to do that. I'm with the machine. Remote printing is more than convenient enough. Local printing just means I have to sneaker net a USB stick, over to the printer. So before I do remote printing, why don't we actually get the printer connected to the Wi-Fi? So on the back left of the printer is where the power cord plugs in, and there's a switch back there. One thing you'll notice right off the bat, if you've had an older printer, I have a Peoply Phenom. I've also had a couple Anycubic printers, Photon S, etc. The Z-axis motor is like near silent. I can't even tell if it's on or moving. On the front, we have a USB-B connector, so that's kind of like your typical USB printer cable. I'm not sure in what situation we would use this. It's not really talked about in the printed guide here. Obviously, USB sticks, we know what that's for. And then, as I mentioned, you can connect this to the cloud. So let's hop right in here. We can see at the top, we don't have Wi-Fi. So let's go to Settings and Wi-Fi. And then we've got our 3D Printing Canada guests. So we will go there and then we'll type in our password. Okay, so we can see check mark, we're connected. If we go back here, we now see the Wi-Fi symbol at the top there. So we're all connected, that's good. Let's poke around here a little bit. So we have cleaning and settings. So this is going to expose for 30 seconds. So what does that mean? This is going to light up the entire mask, so the whole vat will be lit up and cured for 30 seconds. 30 seconds is similar to that bottom layer exposure time. So it will create a solid layer of resin across the whole bottom of the vat that we can then scrape off in one sheet, removing any small particulate and stuff that might be on there. So that's what they mean by cleaning. It does use a considerable amount of resin, probably more than our little town would use. But sometimes that's just a necessity. Sorry. Okay, update. And so we can do a local upgrade. That's where we would download the firmware and put it in the USB stick, or we can do the network upgrade. All right, we're already upgraded to the latest version. So I did do this already. I've since taken the printer and done my test prints on it, but I did upgrade to the newest version, and that matches the newest version on the website. It was simple. I just had upgrade. It took maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and the machine was done. So that's really nice and convenient and worked exactly as expected. Let's go back here. Let's check out some printer settings. So printing parameters. So the way that I understand this is the default printing parameters. Now we saw in the sliced file there that I put in these parameters, these exact same values, right? When you choose a print, you get to choose if you want to use the parameters that the file was sliced with, or do you want to override them with something else? That's really useful because I might have sliced that for 3D resin solutions, black. And right now I might have, I don't know, Anycubic green or something, Soraya Tech gray. And I might want to change those settings for that particular resin that I have in there. I don't have to reslice the whole file because nothing major changed other than the exposure times that I need. So that's really convenient to be able to do that. We have the Z-axis movement. This bit is a little bit confusing. Back to 0, 0 is the top of the machine. I'm used to 0 being the bottom, so it would bring it all the way down to the vat. Back to zero will zero it up to the top, and leveling will bring it all the way to the top and then all the way to the bottom so that you can put in that leveling card to check your leveling. There is no up or down, like separate independent up-down buttons. So if you want to raise your build plate, you hit back to zero and it starts moving up, and then you hit stop when it's at the height you want. And then if you wanted to bring it down, you actually hit leveling, which will bring it all the way to the top and then start coming down, and then you can hit stop wherever you want, which takes a long time because it moves really slow. That seems very strange. I wasn't able to find anywhere in here to just override and move up, down freely. Device control. So this seemed to be an option to have camera monitoring, and it can also do time lapse or something. Maybe that's what this guy is for. I don't have the camera. I also wonder how good it's going to look through the plexiglass. And depending on the size of your model, there's not much to see. I mean, our town is less high than the VAT is, so there's really nothing to see until it's done. And then here, this is important. If we're going to print over Wi-Fi, we need to put in a password to kind of secure who can send prints to this machine. I've put in ABC, super secure. So let's remember that as we go back to the computer. What else do we have? Details is going to give me the software version, hardware ID, telephone information, our IP address, etc. And then Creality Cloud. This is probably where we would scan the Creality Cloud app to connect it to our Creality Cloud account. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do cloud slicing or publishing to the cloud. If that's something you're interested in, knock yourself out. We already checked out update and other settings. Language, we're fine. There's like some themes here. We can do like a colorful theme. I have to restart, so I don't want to do that. Snow mountains. I'm just going to use the standard simple theme. I don't care. I guess this would be like a factory reset option. So time lapse, so that's what I was talking about. If you've got the camera, you've got some time lapse options, how many layers, take a picture every X layers. And then printer maintenance. So replacement cycle remind. Interesting. FEP film. Okay, so that answers my question. Maybe we are using FEP still. So FEP film and how many hours are remaining on it, and air filter. So there's a small air filter at the back on the top. How many hours are remaining on that, and you can reset them or set them to custom amounts. So just to remind you to swap those out. You'll know when your FEP film needs to be replaced, especially if you have a failure or some sort of scratch or mark that's on your film that's appearing in your prints. So let's flip back to the computer. Now that we've got it hooked up to the Wi-Fi, let's try remote printing. Okay, so Halot One Pro knows Amerilab's test part, knows the IP address of the machine, password error. Okay, let's enter the password. ABC. Okay. Disconnected, maybe let's refresh. Oh, my Wi-Fi disconnected. That was weird. There we go. So let's go start transmission. There we go, transferring, so you saw that. So it's loaded it onto the machine, and I'll hit start printing. Let's make sure that the build plate is clear, and it is, and then we'll hit yes. So as I mentioned, it's going all the way to the top to zero out, and then it's going to start coming all the way down and start printing our Amerilab's town. One thing that I'll mention right now is I am not a fan of having to pull these off the top like that. I always seem to like hit the build plate or hit the back on my way up, and I'm gonna scratch it, and then I've got to find somewhere to place this and then put it back on. I would much prefer something that flips up, flips open. There's other nicer ways, I feel, to go about this. I'm gonna pause that and just show you on the screen here what I meant about overriding the settings for a particular print. So as I mentioned, I hit pause there. We can see a preview of what it's gonna print. We can see the layer thickness, and it's 300 layers in this guy. I could continue and it will pick up where it left off. I could stop, which just aborts the print. But here I can go settings. This is where I can override the exposure time. So these are the exposure times and speeds that were grabbed from the slice. I can't change the number of bottom exposure layers, and I can't change the bottom exposure time, likely because the print is already, started. If I was starting the print from a USB, when I select the file, it's going to ask me what I want to do as far as the settings go. But maybe for this resin, I only needed 2 seconds or 2.9. I can make that change there. So that's what that means. Okay, configuration saved. I didn't really make any changes. So then I could hit continue and we'd be off to the races. So now I want to show you what it's like from the USB stick. So I'm just going to abort this and go back. Put this guy in. Give it a second to read and then print. And so now here's the files that are on here. So I've also sliced the Amerilabs town and placed it on here, but there's the Bulldog and there's something called Hawkman. So the Bulldog, you'll see that there's like a download arrow. So when I choose this, it imports the model from the USB stick to the machine, and then it says 2 seconds, and then it goes back. And so now this is on the machine right here, and it's ready to print. So this is like import versus what's already on the machine. So if I pull this out and go print, I've got the file that was imported already to the machine here. So I actually don't need the USB stick once I've imported and it's printing. It's autonomous at that point, right? So I'll go back. And let's take a look at what the prints turned out like. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 test prints. So this was the Bulldog. I printed this guy twice. I kept this one with the supports so that you could see what happened. So they had it sliced. I overrode the settings to make them exposure specific to the resin I was using. So 3 seconds per layer in my case, 40-second bottom layers, two base layers. And you can see here that the supports have actually broken away from under his chin. So as a result, his chin's kind of all smashed. I cured this without rinsing it in rubbing alcohol. Not advisable, but that is why it's shiny and lost some of its detail. But even as it is, you can see like the slight furriness to the smooth part of his body, as well as obviously the fur on his back. And then because it's been cured, it's going to be very crunchy, but I could break all those supports off at this point. He also, his front leg here is detached from his body. So in the other one as well, that leg was actually floating in the resin and I had to scoop it out. A little bit on that in a second. But it's detaching again here. So there's a few issues with this. I'd like to slice it again myself, just to ensure that it's nothing with the slice. And I don't know what resin it was sliced with. Their settings weren't quite what I needed for my resin, so I did have to override those. But aside from that breaking off, like the level of detail that it was able to keep is fantastic. It's a little bit smooth, like there's no moire, none of that effect on it, you know, that fish scaling kind of effect on the X and Y. But enough about that guy. Something a little more detailed. So I printed 2 of the Amerilabs town. So this one was done in 3-second layers, and this one here was done in 2.7-second layers. Doesn't sound like a big difference, but I mean, that is 10%, right? There are some details on here, these tiny little spires on top of the buildings. They're so small, they don't even stand up under their own weight. So they're just like flopped over, they look like hairs. And some of them didn't even render. So the 4th row of them didn't even render. Sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th row of them didn't even render. I don't even know how small those details are, but like I said, quite literally, they look like hairs or like little tiny, you know, pieces of fluff almost. But the level of detail that this was able to capture is fantastic. The side of the Amerilabs town there where it had the Amerilabs logo, it really is not discernible as a logo. I can see that there are circles and that they have some depth to them, but I wouldn't be able to make out what it is at all. One of those logos is like inset, one of them is kind of raised. They're indiscernible there. But on the back, the gaps between, I'll use this one, the gaps between all of those little slits in there that I showed on the model, they're perfectly clean and crisp, you know, very discreet, so they're not blended or overexposed or anything. I did have a little bit of overexposure at the 3-second range, but at 2.7 seconds, that was even sharper. And then I do rinse these in an ultrasonic cleaner I put them in a bag of rubbing alcohol, put them in the bath of water in the ultrasonic, let them run for probably 5 minutes, I think is the default timer on mine. Then I take them out and I just give them a quick wash in fresh, clean rubbing alcohol in another container, and then air dry before I cure them. And I'm curing these in a homemade curing microwave. So I only cure them for about 40 seconds. But anyway, you can cure them with any UV light in the proper UV spectrum range for that resin. So I have this other print here. It's called the Resin XP2 Validation. I'm not even sure where it came from, to be honest. But there's a couple neat things that we can check here. So first and foremost, these raised circles, there are 15 of them and they get progressively smaller, and there are 14 inset ones down here. I was only able to render 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 of the raised ones. The 14th and 15th, if they did print, they got ripped off and they're floating around in the resin somewhere. On the inset side, I wasn't able to render the smallest one of them. So the rest of them are, I can see right through them. So those turned out pretty nice. In the center here, you can check over or under exposure. If there's any gap here, then it's underexposed, and if it's bled together, that's overexposed. So you should be able to slide like a piece of paper in between all of these intersecting points in the center there. And then same thing here, these get progressively smaller, and the last two here, you can just see little wisps of them. They didn't really get rendered or they got ripped off. So if they're not getting rendered or getting ripped off, maybe I need to increase the exposure a little bit, but you want to make sure that the gaps between these bottom ones are not bleeding together either, at which point you're overexposing and losing that detail. So it's a bit of a balancing act. I did notice that a lot of things are sticking to that film like aggressively. You can hear it as it's peeling away, even when there's not a large surface area like this, like on the Ameritown or Amerilabs town. I could hear it like pulling off of there each layer. So this turned out good. It did curl a little bit when I cured it. It is very, very thin. It's maybe just a couple sheets of paper thick for the base anyway. But that kind of gives you an idea of the level of detail you'll be able to render accurately and check your exposure settings, and this takes very, very little resin to do. I actually printed it twice. And this is the interesting part. So I mentioned earlier, things floating around in the resin. So when I printed this, I noticed this little blip here at the bottom. While increasing my exposure helped me, have some of those things render and stay attached, some of those little lines I was mentioning, I didn't lose any detail on the voids, so that was good, it's not too high, but then I had that little blip there. On the bottom of the FEP, if I pulled the vat out, there's a section of the FEP that's got like a wrinkle in it now. So there was likely some floater that got squished to the FEP when the build plate came down to do the first layer, and then that blip on the FEP now translates to every layer in your print. So in this case, if I'm printing on that area of the build surface, I'm going to have that defect in my print. So I'm going to have to change the FEP or work around it as far as shifting my prints goes. Now, if I was printing armies of these guys, I could, orient them around that section of the FEP and just avoid it. If I was doing runs of that, it wouldn't be an issue. But if I'm printing a bunch of random stuff and I place this in the middle of the bed, at the bottom corner, I'm always going to have that defect, right? So anyway, we're going to get some tight close-up shots of these so you can hopefully see some of the detail that I can see. Sometimes you have to tip it just to get it in the right light, but it is crazy that you can make out the individual floors, and this whole thing is, sits on the tip of your finger. It's super, super tiny. It's just a little bit wider than maybe almost a quarter at the widest, and the base here is, well, smaller than a penny. So a couple things that are nice quality of life. It's got markers for how much resin you've got in your vat. So, if I'm printing something and I know it takes 480 milliliters, I'm going to want to probably fill this up to the 600 mil max. Now, mind you, you don't want to fill it up to 600 mil and then drop the build plate in there. That might push it over the edge, so just be cautious of that. And then you've got the little kind of pouring spouts in the corner to pour it out. I've already poured out most of the resin, just a little bit left in there. The screws here, another nice feature is that instead of pulling, unscrewing knobs and then having to slide this off the threaded rods, the threaded rods are unscrewing from the base and they are attached to the build plate, or sorry, to the vat. So I can just lift this off and they come with it and then slide it back on. There's little screw markers to kind of center it and then screw that back on. So that's kind of neat. Likewise, the build plate has two little detents, so you kind of lift it up and off. So that just makes sure that it's always kind of like centered. Slide that back on. And then you've got, the coupler. And one thing I noticed is the coupler where it meets the base, there's even like a rubber grommet there. So if you did happen to spill resin, not that I've ever done that, it's not going to fall inside the case here into the electronics. You've got a little bit of protection there, so that's kind of neat. If it spills out here, it's not going to go inside, it's going to spill down the side. But you should be careful with resin. I know that these parts are clean, so I am touching them with my bare hands. I wouldn't be sticking my finger in there or touching the build plate. I would be wearing gloves. But just to kind of show you some of the quality of life things that I like there, make sure that this is screwed down tight before you start printing. So there we go. And this guy as well. So now when you are leveling the build plate, if you did go through that process, you would hit that, the leveling button. It will go up to the top and then it'll come all the way down. When it comes all the way down, you take your vat out, you put in your leveling card or piece of paper, then it comes down and sandwiches that piece of paper. When you're sandwiching, these screws should be loose. So that allows the build plate to just float there. So when it comes down, it'll land on your paper gently. It'll just be floating. You'll press down on it, and then you can screw in these screws to kind of lock that firmness in place. And you want to make sure that it's equally firm, pressing against your sheet of paper front to back, side to side, right? So that it is completely level. Once you've got that done though, and these are good and tight, you shouldn't have to touch it again. Like I said, from the factory, this was perfect, so I'm not going to play with it at all. If you are having uneven build plate adhesion, where maybe the front is sticking but the back is not, it's lifting, then that's a clear indication that you're not level. If you're just having general adhesion issues, make sure you don't have any finger oils or anything on there. Make sure it's nice and clean and dry. You don't want rubbing alcohol residue on there mixing with your resin. And then go through a leveling process, make sure it's level, and maybe increase your base layer exposure. Like I said, as long as you don't care about that bottom layer being overexposed, increase that exposure and that will increase the adhesion to the build plate. There you have it, my first prints, my first calibrations, and my initial thoughts on the Creality Halot One Pro. I was pleasantly surprised that both the online firmware update and the Wi-Fi based printing worked without a hitch. Right from the software, and the software itself was easy to use. I have used Chitdu and Lychee and other slicers before, but it was pretty user-friendly, especially being able to import some free models without having to go to a website and search. It just really helps that ease of entry and initial quick use in printing. Hopefully you found all that useful. I look forward to spending a lot more time with this machine and really pushing the limits, trying to tune out extra speed and maybe a little extra quality like I mentioned on that logo in the future, and try some other fast print resins. As always, thanks for watching, and if you want to see more videos in the future, ring that bell to get notified.